5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff.
You're listening to the GHT Overland Podcast. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on the GHT Overland Podcast.
I do believe this week's guest has logged more miles than any of our past guests.
Starting in Canada, going to Alaska, down through the Americas, then off to Africa. As we learned last week, experiences are far more valuable than things.
Can you even imagine overlanding through the Americas, then spending just short of 3 years overlanding through the most remote places in Africa?
Yes. Why, yes, I can.
No, like seriously, imagine the experiences of both of those all combined.
It's flabbergasting. Like, leaves me speechless. I just want to know if he saw any pangolins.
Seriously?
Yeah.
That's your major thought?
Well, they're kind of cute in their own way.
Well, they are super cute. I'll give you that.
Oh, wild animals?
Well, probably a lot of wild animals.
Ooh, monkeys.
Yep.
Elephants?
Yep.
Cheetah?
I believe that was a cheetah that was licking his arm, which is just nuts. In his, you got to check out his YouTube channel.
Oh, nice kitty.
Yeah, made me a little nervous. In this 2-part episode, we learn a lot. We enjoy a few awesome road stories and thoroughly enjoy our conversation with this week's guest, Dan Grec. Well, figuratively, we.
Yeah, this was a big bummer I missed out on. The trials and tribulations of running a business.
Yep.
Sorry I missed it, Dan.
It was good. Let's launch the intro for Dan and get into this week's episode.
Let's do it.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on the GHT Overland Podcast. This is where you get the greatest interviews and insights from overland travelers around the globe, learning from their stories and experiences as we interview overlanders from places like Australia, Africa, the Americas, and Portugal. You will learn the basics to the advanced in overlanding, so buckle up and get ready for a new adventure. Today's featured guest is Dan Grec of The Road Chose Me. In June of 2009, Dan sold all his belongings, quit his job, and set off on an overlanding adventure of a lifetime. Starting off with a 40,000-mile trip from Alaska to Argentina, going through 16 countries with countless memories. Next up, after about a 4-year break, Dan set off to Africa, logging roughly 54,000 miles, exploring 35 countries in 999 days. We are humbled to have Dan join us today to learn from his experiences and stories of overland travel. So, without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Thanks very much, Chris. I really appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. We're humbled that you've taken the time, so thank you so much for that. And if you would, fill us in on any blanks I may have left out in your intro and tell us a little bit more about you.
I think you've done a great job so far, Chris. Originally, I was born in Australia. You might have guessed from my accent. And there I went on family road trips and camping trips. But my family wasn't into four-wheel driving, so we weren't going kind of really off the beaten path. But then I moved over to Canada about 20 years ago and became straight away addicted to this idea of, getting remote so I can go hiking and snowboarding and camping. And so a succession of vehicles kind of led me to this idea of what about if I go for a really long time? Instead of just a weekend or a week-long trip, what if I go for a couple of years? And that led to the whole Alaska to Argentina thing, and kind of this idea that I didn't want to just sit at a desk for the rest of my life. I wanted to have a life of adventure and get out there. And I like to tell people too, I'm just a regular guy. I didn't have any sponsors. It's not like I work for National Geographic or anything like that. And so basically, if I can do it, then everybody else can do it too.
Yeah, that's really great. And then you took not only did you have the idea to do it, but you took the action and you physically did it. And I think that's one thing that's super important to point out, that sometimes you just have to make that decision and then take the action necessary to hit the road.
That's right. And what I find amazing too is it's much harder thinking about doing it than actually doing it. When I was sitting back here in North America, I was kind of stressing about border crossings, or I was worried, how hard is the language barrier going to be, and all of those million considerations. But then when you're actually doing it, you're like, oh, this isn't nearly as hard as I imagined it might be. And so once you're doing it, it's so enjoyable and so, easy compared to the fears that you had when you were sitting back at home.
That's great. Now, besides not wanting to sit behind a desk for a bunch of time, what was it? Was there anything else that really inspired these trips for you?
I've always been interested, Chris, in meeting new people and going new places. And I love being outside. For me, overlanding is I get to cook outside every day. I sleep in a tent every day. And so I just get to experience nature, whether it's hot or cold or raining or snowing. I feel like it's exciting to be in that every single day.
Now, did you spend a lot of time planning that first overland trip from Alaska to Argentina? And would you recommend spending either more or less time in planning to our listeners?
For me, Chris, the big amount of time for both trips was saving money, and so I had to just keep going to work to save money, and that took years. And while I was doing that, I guess I was planning in the background, but I wouldn't say that I needed to spend a massive amount of time planning. I'm not the kind of person who has a detailed itinerary or an exact route mapped out. I much prefer to make it up as I go along and talk to locals and sort of figure things out as I'm going. And if I really am enjoying a certain country or a certain region, then maybe I'll slow down and find even more things to explore. But if it's somewhere that isn't really working for me for whatever reason, then maybe I'll just kind of hurry up a little bit and get to the next place. So personally, for me, the fun of the journey is like the unknown adventure. And you never quite, when you drive into a new country, you never quite know, am I going to stay for a month? Am I going to stay for a week? What kind of adventures am I going to have? It's like, oh, well, I'm going to find out over the next few days or few weeks.
That's great. So can you give us some details on your Jeep? And I don't know, did you give, is there a name for the Jeep?
I do have a name. The Jeep that I've built now, I built it really specifically for Africa. I learned a lot of lessons when I drove Alaska to Argentina. And so this one has been built very much as a, overlander live out of vehicle. So it has a pop-up roof so I can sleep much better. It has a fridge so I can eat really good food. And then the fridge kind of necessitated dual batteries, a solar panel set up. And then interior-wise, I've built all my own custom cabinets so I can store all of my stuff. And the way that my pop-up roof works, I can actually stand up and walk around in there, which is a bit of a unique feature on a Jeep. And then as well as that, because I was going to West Africa, which is really, really remote, I did put a bunch of four-wheel drive goodies on there as well. So I have a winch, I have modified suspension, I have skid plates, bumpers, a high lift jack, max tracks, kind of the whole catalog of, make this Jeep capable of going anywhere on the planet.
Okay. And what year is the Jeep?
It's a 2011 Rubicon Unlimited.
Okay. And so what's the name you've given it?
So this Jeep is called Sandy because she's tan in color, which is kind of like a dirt color. And before this trip, I owned a rust bucket Subaru, and his name was Rusty. So then Rusty and Sandy just kind of fit together, and the name stuck.
You went through a lot of work putting that together. What was that on your second Jeep you have now for Africa? What was that total amount of time that you put into it?
Well, again, I guess I was saving money mostly was the time factor. And then when it actually came, to bolting things on, I guess I spent maybe close to 12 months in total. I had some misadventures along the way, but in the end, it did take quite a long time because I wanted it to be really purpose-built for what I was doing.
Okay. So what is that one thing you value the most, either on or in your vehicle?
Because I went to Africa, I built a drinking water system. So there's a tank underneath, there's a pump and a filtration system and UV treatment lamp. And so for me, I use that at least 10 times a day during the trip. And, the ability to have clean filtered drinking water when you're in remote Africa, that it makes you feel, happy and safe to just know I can drink essentially unlimited water and it's not a problem. So for me, for where I was going, I think the drinking water setup was the number one.
That's great. And where did you find the tank that fit underneath the Jeep?
Yeah, that was one of the things that took a long time in the build process. I could have had a custom tank made, but they're really expensive, and I'm on a tight budget. So I basically just scoured the internet, and I found actually boat supply stores. They sell tanks in various sizes, and so I just spent hours and hours and hours until I found one that would fit the purpose. And it was only, I think, $60 or something, so it was quite cheap.
Oh, smart. And then what kind of filtration system? Is there like a brand, or was it just a hodgepodge of different things?
Yeah, it's a company actually called Pure UV, and they make typically the kind of filter that would be under your sink in your house. And so it comes with like a replaceable cartridge, and you can change how many microns the filter is. And then they make one that's kind of fancy. It has a UV lamp that runs right down the middle of it, so the water is forced to go past the UV lamp as well. And they do sell a version of it that comes with a 12-volt adapter. So it's designed essentially for RVs. And then so I just put that into my Jeep, and it's been working flawlessly for the whole trip.
That's great. Smart. Okay, cool. So anything you originally packed that you never used or removed from your overall setup?
I definitely had some luxury items with me. On my first trip, I took a guitar, which I never really used. I had a hammock with me that I gave away at some point in Africa. I've got a Frisbee in the Jeep that I've never actually used. So I guess the romantic ideal when you're sitting at home is that you're going to have all this leisure time and be able to do all these fun activities. But for me, the reality is, at the end of the day, I'm kind of just happy to read a book and then fall asleep quite early.
Oh, there you go. Cool. So what are 2 or 3 destinations that you've been that really stand out to you, and what really made them so special for you?
For me, Chris, I drove all the way through Central America and then the northern part of South America. And then when I arrived in Patagonia, so kind of the mountain range that divides Chile and Argentina over on the west coast, that to me, Patagonia is just an amazing destination for overlanding, because it's so wide open and wild. And so you can be camping out in the mountains every single night for free, and you'll find stunning views, beautiful stars at night. And then during the day, you can go hiking, and there's just hundreds and hundreds of random unnamed hikes, and you can just explore to your heart's content. So Patagonia for me was really special for overlanding. As well as that, in West Africa is kind of a really unique place in the world, I think, because not many tourists have been there or go there. And so it's really easy to get, off the beaten path, like we all say. And so for me, kind of the real core of Central Africa, like Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, and then the 2 Congos, those countries are unlike anything I've ever seen on the planet. And I don't know if there's anywhere else on the planet like that, in terms of how remote you can get and kind of how full on the adventure can be. You go places where they've never seen white people, for example, cross borders, and the border guard says he's never seen a foreigner in his whole life. So for me, that's what I've always longed for, this kind of, I wish I'd been born 100 years ago so I could have been an explorer. And being in West Africa made me feel like that. So I really loved it there.
Oh, that's really cool. So, and I know that when watching some of your YouTube videos, there was like days on end that you were driving. Were you like super nervous about like gas and supplies, or did you do the research and you knew exactly how far you could go and where the next place was that you could get some fuel?
if I knew I was getting remote, I definitely did the research. But even then, Africa is kind of a special beast because, people will say, oh, sure, there's a gas station in that town, but you have no idea if it'll have gas or not. Depends on the day, depends on the week. And so there were a few stints where I was getting pretty nervous and kind of, driving for maybe an hour and then you realize you've gone the wrong way. So then you have to backtrack and so then you start thinking, oh, suddenly my fuel calculations don't quite work out anymore. So yeah, there was a few times where I pushed it quite close and was happy to eventually get somewhere where they would sell me gas.
So if you had all the fuel that you could possibly carry, like how many miles could you drive?
Yeah, so my setup, when I'm on good roads, I can drive 600 miles. And I actually did that once on a paved road. When I got to the Congo, the refinery had been turned off and there was no gas in the whole country. But when the roads get bad, the Jeep consumption just goes up and up. And so definitely 400 miles could be a stretch, maybe even 350 when I was plowing through the mud in the Congo was about my maximum. So actually not a very long range.
Yeah, I know exactly how far my Jeep will go. And I was like, man, how did he travel for days on end?
So I put an external tank on the back. I carry an extra 13 gallons on top of the stock 22 gallons. And then for various stretches, I did also carry another 5-gallon jerry can. So I think at one point I was carrying right around 40 gallons of gas.
Got it. Okay. So when you're out there, like what's a favorite meal that you like to prepare and enjoy?
Yeah, pretty much every village that you come to in Latin America and in Africa, they'll always have some kind of street market going on. And it might just be a handful of ladies kind of selling tomatoes and bell peppers and carrots, or it could be, a full-blown market selling more or less everything you could get in a supermarket here. And so I love to just wander around those markets and see what's for sale and then try to make a conglomeration out of that. So I guess most of my meals turned out to be sort of stir-fry everything vegetable with maybe rice or maybe pasta. I really enjoy all the tropical fruits when I'm near the equator. So I often have mangoes, pineapples, watermelons, and they're plentiful and extremely cheap when you're in those parts of the world.
Oh, that's cool. So any tips you've got on getting groceries when you go into these smaller villages and towns?
Yeah, definitely. I would say make sure you go into the little street markets because they're always so fun and the people there, they're entertained by you and you're entertained by them. So you can have a lot of fun. And the big one for buying meat is I was given this advice, make sure you always buy it in the morning because a lot of places don't have refrigeration at all. And so if they've just slaughtered an animal that morning, if you come and buy it within an hour or so, it's relatively fresh, and it doesn't have flies on it. But if you were to buy it later in the afternoon, basically it's just been sitting in the hot sun all day. And so as long as you buy, before about 10 o'clock in the morning, you can be pretty sure, in fact, that the meat is fresher than anything you've ever bought in a supermarket here.
Good advice. Cool. How do you generally do your laundry on the road? Have you found a way that works for you using like laundromats, or what have you kind of figured out, especially like in Africa or as you went through South or Central America and the most remote places?
Yeah. In Central and South America, I almost always was able to find some sort of laundromat or some sort of laundry service. If you were in a town that foreigners had been to before, invariably someone would have a sign up that said, we'll do your laundry for a couple of dollars. And so that sort of made it easy because I didn't have to do it myself. So I got lazy.
Sure.
But in Africa, I almost never saw such a thing. And so, in fact, for the entire trip, I just did my laundry myself by hand. And so I just have a big bucket and some laundry detergent, and I kind of do a big wash, by hand, pushing the clothes in and out for maybe half an hour. Then I rinse them probably twice and then just hang them on my line. And the downside to that is it does use up a lot of water. And so I really could only do my laundry when I was near a water source. So if I was out remote, I just didn't do laundry, basically.
Okay. Hygiene, how did you manage that? Any tips you've got for our listeners I don't know if you carried any sort of like a shower bathroom setup, or what are your tips that people could learn from in doing these, especially in the most remote areas, in staying hygienic?
Right. So for a shower, I just have like a black bag, a solar shower that I hang in the sun.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah. And so my routine usually was, as soon as I found somewhere to camp, I would kind of throw that thing in the sun and then, potter around doing whatever I was doing. And then right at sunset, I would just take a really quick shower, even just more of a rinse, just to get off the dust and the sweat. And that really made, climbing into bed and going to sleep just so much more enjoyable. So for me, that worked really well. And then when that wasn't really possible, baby wipes are a really great option. Carry some of those, and they can definitely make you feel a lot better if you've been a few days without a shower. And in terms of a toilet, I don't carry anything. I just have a shovel and go out in the wilderness.
There you go. Keep it simple. Anything you change about your current setup?
Probably the worst thing about my Jeep right now is that it's too heavy. Because I loaded up on all of the four-wheel drive goodies, and I loaded up on all of the overland stuff, and it has all of my possessions in it, all of my clothes, my food, my camera gear. It weighs a little over 6,000 pounds, and I think it's rated to about 5,750. So it is heavy. So it wallows. Yeah. It doesn't really like corrugations. So I would love if I could shave off 500 pounds. And the only way I've come up with to do that would be to fill it full of helium balloons.
Well, I guess you could try that. Let us know how that works.
That's right. So I don't know how to make it lighter, but I wish I could.
Yeah, I can understand that. So tell us about that number one biggest challenge you've had to face on the road and how you overcame those challenges.
Oh, wow. Biggest challenge on the road. For me, the craziest or the worst thing that ever happened, I was in remote Uganda by myself, and actually the Jeep rolled over on its side. And so that was, at the time, the scariest thing that had ever happened in my life. And I thought actually the trip was finished. I thought I'd destroyed the Jeep. I actually thought that I was going to take my passport out and start walking. And I had no idea where I was going to walk to. I just thought, this is it. I've done it. But one of the amazing things that Africa teaches you is don't stress. There's always a way. It's okay. We'll find a solution. This is Africa, as people say. And so within about 10 minutes, locals started showing up and asking if I was okay. And then we worked together, and I winched it off a tree, and they pushed on the side, and the Jeep came back up onto its wheels. And then over the span of the next few hours, I kind of cleaned everything up and duct tape a whole bunch of stuff back together, and the Jeep was fine, and the trip was able to continue. So that was a really good learning lesson for me of don't get hyper stressed in the moment. Try really hard to just take a step back and say, it'll be all right. There will be a way forward. Let's just take a deep breath, drink some cold water, and use our brains instead of getting all worked up about it.
Yeah, and that was absolutely fascinating to watch on your YouTube channel, that you're completely remote and these people just start showing up.
Yeah.
Are there villages just off from most of the roads? Is that something that you would experience often?
Yeah, exactly. It's a really common saying in Africa that you're never alone. And, it's a positive thing to say because it means there's always community, but also it is quite literally true. Even when you drive to somewhere you think you're really, really far away from people, if you just wait 5 minutes, some people will show up. They're living out in mud huts. They're just so far off the grid. They're not even connected to the world. And that's their home, and they love it out there, and they live out there. And so it was really, really common to sort of find a really remote place and think, oh, great, I'm all alone for the evening, and then suddenly have 5 villagers show up who just wanted to shake hands and say hello.
That's fascinating. And you were able to communicate with them primarily just English, right?
I was lucky there in Uganda. Yeah, one guy especially spoke enough English to get the message across. Okay. In West Africa, primarily I spoke French, and I just learned that as I went along. And then there were other countries where the language barrier was much harder, and it really was hard to communicate with people. It was more like charades and smiling got the point across.
That's great. And that one lady wanted your magazine. What was that about?
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I guess, I was still pretty stressed, and I guess she was just stoked to see color photos in a magazine. And so that was, she was so happy to have that.
It's probably a prized possession still to this day.
I wonder about that sometimes, if people still kind of talk about me being there, or various towns that I got to. They're like, oh, yeah, remember that crazy guy who drove through?
Without a doubt. Yeah. That's great. So border crossings, what tips do you have in preparing for them, and how long do you anticipate most of them are going to take?
Yeah, so for me, I usually try to sort of gear up for what I call a border crossing day. So I try to camp or stay, within a couple of hours of the border. I don't like to be too close, but close enough that I know I'll be there early morning or mid-morning. And I sort of mentally prepare a little bit. I make sure my passport's handy. I make sure, my visa hasn't expired and my temporary import permit's still valid, and, double check all of those things are in order. And then so I get up and get moving. I try to get to the borders, 9 a.m. would be ideal. Maybe 10 a.m. is okay. That way you've really got the whole day and you don't have to stress about it getting dark or, kind of rushing. And for me, it's all about setting expectations. I basically show up to all of these borders expecting that it's going to take the whole day. And so I have my cold water with me. I have snacks ready. And if I have to sit in the shade for 3 hours while I wait for some stamp, then that's okay. I'm not stressed. And so what usually happens is, I'm expecting it to take 10 hours. And then when it only takes 3 hours, I'm really happy. And I can drive away from the border feeling good. Whereas if I showed up expecting it to take 1 hour and it took 3, I'd probably be a bit annoyed. And so for me, the majority of the borders really did only take 1 to 3 hours, I would say, on the outside. And they were never stressful. They were never scary. They're always just lots of waiting, lots of smiling, lots of handshaking, and you can get through.
Interesting. Any specific border crossing experiences that stand out to you?
I did drive into Egypt right at the end of the trip, and Egypt is a really special country in the world. It's one of the hardest countries in the world to drive your own vehicle into. They just make it bureaucratically so complicated, and so it's very different. And actually, for the first time in my life, I paid for a fixer at that border. Normally, I try very hard not to use them, but actually, that border is impossible without one. And it took about 8 hours. And so I had to get a license, an Egyptian driver's license, which is all written in Arabic. I had to get Egyptian license plates for the Jeep, which were in Arabic. And so it just kind of goes on and on and on. But again, the usual advice really paid off of just be patient and smile and shake a lot of hands. And even if it's taking a long time, there's always progress, and you just slowly tick off all of the insane bureaucratic items that need to be ticked off. And then eventually someone says, okay, you're done. See you later.
I can only imagine the relief at that point especially after 8 hours of going through that.
Yeah.
That you can finally enter the next country and see what's beyond its borders.
And that one was surreal as well, because that was the final border crossing of the trip. And so, driving into country number 35, I'm like, this is the last time I'll do this. And yeah, so it was quite emotional and quite a huge relief to successfully, complete my goal of I want to drive into Egypt.
That's great. Any specific safety planning you do or tips you can provide our listeners on safety and security as you're overlanding?
A couple of things that I do, Chris, is I'm conscious when I walk around that I don't, show kind of money. And so I don't wear a watch. I don't wear any jewelry. My clothes certainly aren't new. And I never, pull out a phone and kind of play around with like a big touchscreen device, because I feel like all of those things are just sort of showing people, hey, I've got money. I've got, why don't you come and rob me? And the other thing that I do, the wallet that I walk around with, when I'm in a street market or any time, it actually doesn't have anything important in it at all. It has a photocopy of my driver's license, and it has about $10 cash and then some old business cards that are just junk. And in that way, I feel confident that if I was to get pickpocketed or if someone put a knife on me to say, give me your wallet, I would just be really happy to give it to them. I would not feel, that I'm losing big time. And so actually that's never happened. I've never been robbed or pickpocketed. But it gives me that sort of peace of mind of like, I actually don't even care if someone did steal it because it's really not that important to me.
Okay. And when you were camping or you stopped, any point that you felt either maybe a little bit uneasy or unsafe and maybe changed where you parked for the night?
That has maybe only happened once or twice ever. And sort of specific circumstances required that. But on the whole, I just kind of scope out the vibe, and anyone who's nearby, I make a big point to go over and say hello and shake hands, and ask if it's okay if I camp there. I would never want to camp near someone or on their property without actually asking first. And from memory, every single time people have said, yes, no problem. I've never actually been told, no, you can't be here.
So the world is possibly a little bit safer than what everybody thinks?
I think that's a pretty safe thing to say, yes.
So, number 1, Dan has 5 books he's written. The links are in the show notes. And if you are remotely interested in long-term overland travel, run, don't loiter, and go check out his books.
Nice. Run, don't loiter.
Absolutely.
That's a good one. Lisa, does a helium tank weigh less when it's full than when it's empty?
That's a very good question.
Is that not a mind twister?
It is.
I think Dan's idea of a bunch of helium balloons to lose 500 pounds in his Jeep might work. Yeah. And if they all exploded, at least you'd sound funny.
The funny guy driving through Africa.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, I'm sure that our past guests have mentioned it before, but for some reason, it really jumped out to me this time. You're never alone in Africa.
So the story Dan told when his Jeep rolled over, then all the people just started emerging. Then I understood watching the video on his YouTube channel. That was wild.
Pun intended?
Yes.
That was wild?
It was wild.
You're just full of it today.
I am. Because it was like, and they're all dressed very colorful. Like the women had colorful outfits on. Super
colorful, super neat, clean.
Yeah.
It's absolutely a different culture, society. And then that one woman wanted his magazine.
Yeah.
Because of the colorful pictures and everything, because they like color, and a magazine like that may be something that they spoke English.
Yeah.
How crazy was that? There was a couple of them that spoke.
Yeah, I read.
Actually, like
she said,
good English.
Yeah.
It's just crazy. The experiences. It is all about experiences and what they're able to overcome. Like, oh, your Jeep tipped over. Let's just tip it back. You'll be back on the road. No big deal.
Yeah, it's just like all manpower.
Yeah, and much like Dan, we would have been the same way. Total panic mode. Like, well, the trip could be completely over right now.
Yeah, but who'd have thought that his truck would have rolled?
Yeah, well, things happen. You have to overcome your challenges, whether it be in Africa or whether it be tomorrow. What a fun episode with so much to learn from.
I'm really looking forward to next week. Like, seriously, since I missed the whole interview.
Yes, you did. You were not here. And it is a good one. We got lucky. Finances is one of Dan's favorite topics. So get ready.
Ooh.
Some serious info on this one. More great tips and stories from the road next week.
Our interview with Dan is our longer format interview, so we split these into 2 episodes for your downloading pleasure. Don't worry, new episodes are released each Thursday.
In next week's episode, we dive into those finances, learn more about the finer details of Dan's overlanding setup, and enjoy more road stories from Dan's overlanding travels, learning valuable tips and ideas.
Remember, it's a good idea to visit the show notes page on our website at ghtOverland.com/podcasts select the Road Chose Me episode. All the details and helpful links are already there for you.
Be sure to send your questions, suggestions, and feedback to ghtOverlandPodcast@gmail.com. And of course, we'd love it if you'd connect with us on the social medias at GHT Overland. We're mostly active on Instagram and Facebook. You can also send us a tweet on the old Twitter if you'd like. And of course, feel free to share the GHT Overland podcast with all your friends.
If you enjoyed the episode, it would mean the world to us if you slid over to rate and review the podcast. Then be sure you're a subscriber. It's free and you get automatic uploads of each new episode. So go give the GHT Overland podcast a little extra love on your podcast platform of choice. Please and thank you. And we will see you next Thursday for part 2 of the GHT Overland podcast with Dan Grec of The Road Chose Me. Bye.